One of the themes of 19th century Romantic art was the world and the spirit, experiences that go beyond or below our conscious control. The grandeur of the outer world, seen as a sacred place, as the trace of God's creation, and the conflicts and terrors of the inner one, the unsatisfied self. The search for these precarious images of man and nature was one of the great projects that the 19th century bequeathed to modernism. From classical times through many centuries of Christianity, man and nature were considered to be in the reliable pastoral care of God. But in the 19th century, God died, and artists weren't feeling too well either. Strangely enough, it was in this idyllic landscape that one great painter, in his last years before suicide, was to express his own sense of isolation in the world. This is the lunatic asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in the south of France, near Arles. For a year and 8 days, from May 1889 to May 1890, Vincent van Gogh was under treatment here. Just what his illness was, nobody to this day is quite sure. The one aspect of its symptoms that everybody knows about was that he cut off his earlobe and gave it to a prostitute in Arles. He suffered, as they say, from manic depression, which is an opaque way of skirting an issue that we still don't understand.
Though you continually hear terrible cries and howls like beasts in a menagerie, in spite of that, people get to know each other very well and help each other when their attacks come on. When I'm working in the garden, they all come to look, and I assure you they have more discretion and good manners to leave me alone than the good people of the town of Arles.
The garden and the asylum look much as they did in Van Gogh's time. Even his irises are still there.
There are people who love nature even though they are cracked or ill. Those are the painters. Then there are those who like what is made by men's hands, and these even go so far as to like pictures. Though here there are some patients very seriously ill, the fear and horror of madness that I used to have is already much lessened.
He suffered from agonizing fits of paranoia and a kind of paralysis of the will accompanied by hallucinations during which he couldn't work at all. And these were separated by long, clear months during which he could and did, which were in turn punctuated by the most extraordinary moments of visionary insight. At such moments, everything he saw was swept up in a current of energy. Everything he sees is made from the same plasma. The moon comes out of eclipse, the stars blaze, the sky heaves like the ocean, and the cypresses move with it. Van Gogh's cypresses are like thick, dark lightning conductors grounding the energies of the sky and the earth. They are alive as no painted tree had ever been and as no real cypress could be.
The cypresses are always occupying my thoughts. It astonishes me that they have never been done as I see them. The cypress is as beautiful in line and proportion as an Egyptian obelisk, a splash of black in a sunny landscape.
Just outside the asylum walls, you can walk in Van Gogh's olive grove and measure the way that he changed it, inventing the form of the dry grasses and the flickering blue shadows on them, and turning the olive trunks themselves into shapes like human bodies, grown old and arthritic with work. Again, the continuous field of energy, pouring through the light, rising from the ground, solidifying in the trunks. You can see his landscapes motif by motif, without necessarily seeing what he saw. But Van Gogh's sense of a power behind the natural world was so strong that once you have seen the paintings, you have no choice but to see the real places in terms of them. Another artist might have found these landscapes of twisted grey limestone formless, unpaintable. What Van Gogh found in them was a perfect unity between the shapes of those strangely distorted rocks, their fierce plasticity, and the details within them, the grain of the rock, how it's scooped and veined, how it resembles the grain of old olive roots, silvery grey too, how the flower shape is echoed in the close detail, and how both accord with the sharp linear strokes of his brush. One of his favourite sites was over the Plaine de la Crau, whose flat fields and furrows and trees were, he said, as infinite as the sea, only better because people lived on them. To draw them, he used an amazing range of notation, every shape suggested by a different dot or stroke or squiggle, everything seen, nothing generalised about. Few drawings have this richness of surface. It feels as though the life of the landscape is bursting through the paper, so that the brown ink becomes almost as eloquent as the colour in his paintings. Van Gogh's paintings were not the work of a madman. They were done by an ecstatic who was also a great formal artist. Today, the doctors would give him lithium and tranquilizers, and we wouldn't have the paintings, perhaps. We don't know. For Van Gogh confronted the world with a kind of insecure joy. Nature was to him both exquisite and terrible. It consoled him, but it was his judge. It was the fingerprint of God, but the finger was always pointed at him. Sometimes the eye of God was, too, the yellow disk of the sun, huge and merciless, the emblem of Apollo. What Van Gogh called the gravity of great sunlight effects filled his work not only with a flood of colour, but also with a symbolism that one can only call religious, the idea that human life is lived beneath an immense exterior will, and that work, like sowing and reaping, is not simply work, but an allegory of life and death.
I saw in this reaper, a vague figure struggling like a devil in great heat to finish his task, I saw then in it the image of death, in the sense that humanity would be the wheat one reaps. So it is, if you like, the opposite of the sower I had tried before. I find it strange that I saw like this through the iron bars of a cell.
Such things did not come by chance. Van Gogh knew what he was looking for when he came south, and of course he found it, bringing the high spiritual ambitions of a northern romantic from Holland into a landscape of the senses. He went there, he wrote,
"Because not only in Africa, but from Arles onward, you are bound to find beautiful contrasts of red and green, of blue and orange, of sulphur and lilac. And all true colourists must come to this, must admit that there is another kind of colour than that of the north."
There was, and he fixed it, as no artist has done before or since. Van Gogh was 37 when he shot himself, but in the last 4 years of his life he'd changed the history of art. The freedom of modernist colour, the way that emotions are worked upon directly by optical means, was one of his legacies, as it was Gauguin's too. But Van Gogh had taken this even further than Gauguin, because he had opened up the modernist syntax to pity and terror, as well as to formal research and pleasure. He was the hinge upon which 19th century Romanticism turned into 20th century Expressionism, and as he lay dying, another artist, 10 years younger and many hundreds of miles to the north, was preparing to take this process a step further. In Van Gogh's work, you can see the self scratching to be let out, but in Edvard Munch's, the self is out. And if that bony Norwegian face which he scrutinized and painted for 70 years, starting like a young pastor and going through the stages of bohemia and middle age to finish like a paranoid old Viking, if that face still haunts us, it is because Munch was the first modern painter to explore the idea of the self as a battleground. 25 years ago, there was not a general agreement about Munch's greatness. Many people who should have known better kept on thinking of him as a sort of gaunt psychotic troll whose obsessive self-inspection didn't make much sense below the Arctic Circle. but today he seems in every way as universal an artist as Ibsen or Strindberg. He was almost literally raised in the family sick room in a dreadful atmosphere of whispers, silences, vomit and carbolic acid.
Disease and insanity were the black angels on guard at my cradle. In my childhood I felt always that I was treated in an unjust way, without a mother, sick, and with threatened punishment in hell hanging over my head.
A great deal of Munch's creative life was spent exorcising the demons of childhood. The sick room, the praying faces, the small twisting hands of anxious women, the terrible apprehension that went with Munch's use of illness as a central metaphor of visionary insight, these surface in the paintings over and over again. So does the fear of women. Munch thought that they were vampires, forces and not social beings. They meant jealousy, misery, tension and the loss of precious bodily fluids. He imagined love as the losing struggle of the male against the female mantis. He felt that men only had two choices, to be castrated by a femme fatale or get rejected by a virgin. This painting, Puberty, carries the clearest of messages. Sex is ominous and hateful. Munch's work oscillated between fantasies of rape and visions of woman as an invincible devourer. In his Madonna, you can almost see the feet sticking out of her mouth. When Munch was at the height of his powers, this was his summer studio at Asgard Strand, a couple of hours by car today outside Oslo. Before Van Gogh, cypresses were just trees. And before Munch, this was just a stony provincial beach with a grey horizon and a pier and rocks and trees coming down to the water. But what he made it into was one of the emblematic landscapes of the modern mind. In his hands, it came to stand for alienation and loss and yearning.
My whole life has been spent walking by the side of a bottomless chasm, jumping from stone to stone. Sometimes I try to leave my narrow path and join the swirling mainstream of life, but I always find myself drawn inexorably back towards the chasm's edge, and there I shall walk until the day I finally fall into the abyss. For as long as I can remember, I have suffered from a deep feeling of anxiety which I have tried to express in my art. Without anxiety and illness, I should have been like a ship without a rudder.
Munch was one of the fathers of Expressionism, which was less a style or a unified movement than an attitude of mind. The idea that reality was so distant and somehow ungraspable that great leaps of emotion must bridge the gap, and that the only secure point in a hostile or indifferent world was the artist's self. Munch's sense of estrangement in the crowd filled his images of the city.
I can see behind everyone's masks. Peacefully smiling faces, pale corpses who endlessly wend their tortuous way down the road that leads to the grave.
This feeling of anxiety and helplessness in the face of big cities was not confined to Munch or to Oslo. Since the mid-19th century, the image of the metropolis as the devourer of souls, a place of lonely crowds and artificial distractions, had been seeping into art and poetry. Soon it would be the main backdrop for European culture. Charles Baudelaire addressed Paris as his ant-swarming city, city full of dreams where in broad day the spectre tugs your sleeve. From the crowded boulevards and cafes of Paris, a peculiarly ironic view of life was emerging, based on disposable style, dandiest display, fleeting encounters. The grimy eddies of social mixture replaced the ordered pyramid of rural France, and they found their painter in Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. In Lautrec scenes of low life at the Moulin Rouge, the face literally becomes the mask. The Belgian painter James Ensor also picked up that image, using it to convey the idea that society was not only unreal, but a sort of demonic carnival, a collective of threatening masks. Art is less spontaneous than we think, and there is no such thing as serious art without a formal language. But the question was, where did one go for the language of extreme emotion, the human shapes of loss and fright? Actors? Medical textbooks? Where? Well, curiously enough, one of the solutions that Munch found would seem to have been archaeology. The cultures that Spain had destroyed in South America in the 16th century were beginning to acquire a certain amount of popular glamour in Paris in the late 19th. Incas, gold, lost cities in the jungle, all that kind of thing. Now, one of the minor sensations of the great Paris exposition of 1889 was this Inca mummy, which had been dug up in Peru. It was buried in the fetal position, which is to us, I don't know about the Incas, the archetypal emblem of fright and the desire for security. Paul Gauguin saw it at the exposition, and he was so moved by it that he copied it. Munch was also very moved by it. And so it is to this withered fetus that used to be a man that we owe probably the most famous image of neurosis in the history of art, the scream.
I stopped and leaned against the railing, half dead with fatigue. Over the grey-blue fjord, the clouds hung, red as blood and tongues of flame. Alone and trembling with fear, I experienced nature's great scream.
This theme of the city as a condenser of anxiety also ran through German expressionism in the years between the turn of the century and World War I, especially in the work of a group of artists which called itself Die Brücke, the bridge, meaning a bridge to the future. Their leader was a young painter named Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who transposed Munch's pessimism into Van Gogh's colour, added the influence of African carvings, and took Berlin as his favourite subject, its streets, its dandies, and its prostitutes. Kirchner's style, with its hatchings and sharp angles and harsh colour, was jittery and highly strung, a visual analogy to cocaine nerves. It was also rooted in a specifically German past, German Gothic without the religious content, full of skinny, unrepentant Mary Magdalens. These predatory ladies are Munch's fatal women, raised to a pitch of style unknown in Norway, and they take the image of the woman as castrator one step further towards pure glamour.
Wenn ich meine Spesen nenne vor dem ewigen Gericht, fragt sich, ob ich dann noch brenne, vielleicht brenne ich auch nicht. Fragt sich, ob ich dann noch brenne, vielleicht brenne ich auch nicht. Wenn ich meine Spesen nenne vor dem ewigen Gericht, kurz und schlecht. Wie gesagt, das ist erst morgen. Morgen, das sind keine Sorgen. Morgen interessiert mich nicht. Und mit morgen kann ich. Heirat für morgen ist Heirat. Jeder heut morgen.
In pre-war Vienna, the leading expressionist was the painter and playwright Oskar Kokoschka, whose early work, including his self-portraits, was more Baroque than Gothic. High-strung, elaborate, switching between elation and misery. They came out of the same milieu as Freud and Schoenberg, that brief moment when Vienna, in the decay of its empire, was one of the capitals of introspective modernism. Kokoschka lived to 1980, and in his 60s he talked about his ambitions as a painter.
Life is so short, and I want to squeeze every bit out of life. Like to live in the light, to live under the sun, it's such a great gift. We forget it today. I'm not a spectator. It's not the vedute I want to paint. It's like an opera. You can see what happens out of it. I want to participate. I identify myself with the object. And therefore, as much in midst of life I want to be. I am an aspire. I'm far away. I'm not here and sitting onlooker, patient onlooker. I'm but active.
The landscape is not so much different for me from a face. I wander in a face, I wander in a landscape. I'm a wanderer. I can't stay stiff and admire. I have to do something. I have to mix it up with myself.
In the twisting hands and strained faces of Kokoschka's portraits, the artist becomes the sitter's accomplice, not by giving him or her a socially useful mask, but by admitting a shared neurosis, a kind of mutual outsidership. This very private, intimate contract between Kokoschka and his sitters was strongest of all in 1912, when he painted himself with Alma Mahler, the great love of his life. His affair with Mahler's widow also inspired Kokoschka to paint what is still the key image of expressionist love, the Tempest. The two lovers whirled along in a cockleshell of a boat, not on the sea, but in space. The shapes turbulent and broken, all highlight and darkness, the air, the lovers' bodies, and the boat caught up in the same ecstatic dislocation of form. The chief expressionist in France was a Polish Jew named Haim Soutine. He was wretchedly poor, and his art became a way of stealing substance from the world. He was obsessed with food, a scraggy chicken on a hook, stared at for days, life seen as meat and as a preparation for death. Soutine could give the carcass of an ox the pathos of a crucifixion. In painting that mass of bone, meat and fat, he was paying homage to Rembrandt, who had painted the same subject. But Soutine gave it an even more intense carnality, as though the thick paint itself were also a paste of meat smeared on the canvas. His landscapes, particularly the ones he painted near Serres in the south of France in 1920 to 22, are even more turbulent, like an extreme distortion of Van Gogh. The hills rear up, the houses lean like rags in a gale, the horizon strains against the sky, and the whole scene becomes one mass of tumbling, visceral paint. Soutine's brushwork looks like chicken guts. Never had a landscape been so transformed by emotion. The violence of the paint predicts the violence that would later surface in American abstract painting, but the images are still concrete. After the Second World War, the English painter Francis Bacon took up Soutine's theme of the dismembered carcass to set forth his own vision of a cannibal's world from which all moral relationships had been erased.
I have tried to be as realistic in my way as I can be. After all, you only have to think about life or have experienced it in any way, or think about the meat on your plate, to think how disturbing what is called reality is. And we are nearly, everybody lives our life screened from it. And if my pictures seem to give over a kind of sense of violence or mortality, it's only in my attempt to be as realistic as I can. Mind you, when you talk about realism, I can only paint for myself. I don't paint for anybody else but for myself, because you can't. You try to bring the thing back onto your own nervous system in its most poignant form.
In Bacon, the ideal body of classical art is dismissed. The nude becomes a two-legged animal with addictions. One of his sources was photography, the early sequential photos of human action by Edvard Munch. In Muybridge's book Animal Locomotion, the naked body is studied with perfect detachment as a machine.
Muybridge are just raw statements of movements. Because every way that a person moves, stands, moves their arms or anything else has not only its movement, but, you may say, all the implications of that movement as well.
In Bacon's paintings, all sexuality is turned into violence, a sort of dog-like grappling in closed rooms whose furnishings you can't identify. The bed suggests a cage or an operating table. The walls and floor are the colour of bad motels. Yet the fragments of a tradition lurk behind the images, and one of Bacon's obsessive emblems was Velasquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X.
I was particularly obsessed by Velasquez's painting of the Pope, and I was at the same time very interested by Eisenstein's photograph in Potemkin of the nurse. And I made a combination, which I think has been very unsuccessful, of the Pope screaming in the way that the nurse. Now, the scream was not to do with expressionism, because I'm not expressionistic. I have nothing to express. I was absorbed by the idea of the color of the mouth, the teeth, the saliva, you may say the beautiful red and purples of the interior, rather of the mouth, rather like Monet was obsessed by haystacks and the light falling on them from hour to hour.
In the face of paintings like this, you may well feel that Bacon has a great deal to express. The other important painter of the disquieting human figure in the 50s was a Dutchman who had emigrated to America, Willem de Kooning. His paintings of women came partly out of American ads, the white smiles and big dominating glamour girls in the lush pop landscape of America's post-war boom, Marilyn with shark teeth.
Hey, Susie Q, what's cooking with you?
Your teeth look whiter than new. My teeth aren't new, but my toothpaste is new Pepsodent. Get with it, kids. New package, new flavor, new formula, too, means brighter smiles for me and you.
You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
Got the message?
Like Kirchner's and Munch's, de Kooning's women are about anxiety. They take the expressionist fear of the fatal woman to an almost comic extreme. Squat, broad, overwhelming and primitive, glimpsed but not analysed, the sex goddess changes into a fiercer and older kind of idol.
It also was like some kind of glimpse, like meeting one of those ladies. So when people say they're not really figures, but they're landscapes, that's true to a certain extent. But they were figures to me. You know, figures maybe in a landscape, or I don't know where exactly. Not here, not there, but somewhere. I don't think that I'm really expressing the world around me, you know, this real world, the so-called real world, it's just something you put up with like everybody else. I'm in my element, and I'm a little bit out of this world. And then I'm in the real world. You know, I'm on the beam. Because when I'm falling, I'm doing all right. When I'm slipping, I say, hey, this is very interesting. It's when I'm standing upright what bothers me. I'm not doing so good. I'm stiff. As a matter of fact, I'm really slipping most of the time into that glimpse. Well, that's a wonderful sensation, to slip into this glimpse. I'm like a slipping glimpser.
This spontaneity of touch and looking, the slipping glimpse, ran all through de Kooning's work, both figurative and abstract. But he and Bacon were among the very few artists who could handle expressionist distortion after the Second World War, because reality had now outstripped art. By the end of the war, the entire world knew what had been done in the death camps of Nazi Germany, and there was no testimony that art could give that could rival the evidence of the photograph. Today, places like Dachau are their own monuments, but any distortion of the human body that an artist might make after 1945 was going to have to bear comparison with what the Nazis had done to real bodies. And very few expressionist paintings could stand this strain. Here, photography was enough. Anything else would have seemed gratuitous. In the face of this, there seemed to be very little that art could say. What we understand about the Holocaust we get from writing and photography. But art had very little to contribute, almost nothing of importance. The effects of this failure are still with us, because after the war there were very few people who believed that art could carry the burden of major social meanings anymore. There would be no more Goyas and Courbets. In the death camps, the only product, as far as art was concerned, was silence. Beside these horrors, there were only two sources of uncontaminated images open to art. One was complete abstraction, the other was the natural world, and artists had been combining and recombining these for 30 years. Just before the First World War, a group of German artists that called itself the Blue Rider had looked to pure nature for transcendental images. One of them was the painter Franz Marc.
I try to heighten my feeling for the organic rhythm of all things, try to feel myself pantheistically into the trembling and coursing of the blood in nature, in trees, in animals, in the air. I see no happier means to the animalizing of art, as I like to call it, than the animal picture. Very early in life, I already found man ugly, and animals seemed to me cleaner and more beautiful. But even in them, I discovered much that was unacceptable and ugly, so that my art instinctively, and out of inner compulsion, became increasingly schematic and abstract.
Mark wrote that from the trenches in 1915. By then, he believed that abstraction was the only route to spiritual knowledge, and certainly it seems to have had a prophetic quality for him. In 1914, he painted this image called Forms in Battle. 2 years later, at the age of 36, he was killed at the Battle of Verdun. Paul Klee had been one of Mark's closest friends. He survived the war and went on to teach at the Bauhaus, and for another 20 years he would produce some of the most exquisite visions of nature in modern art. Small, witty, delicate and mysterious, his idea of the natural world was like the image in this watercolour, the open book, page after page opening backwards into the centre, disclosing another world of growth and form. He loved to invent odd little hieroglyphs that signified unfamiliar corners of nature. He was drawn to structures so small that the normal eye misses them: plant cells, seeds, plankton, diatoms. He loved whimsy and the grotesque, as long as they weren't too scary. Seeing a man with a barrel organ at a fair led to this watercolour entitled "Dance, you monster, to my soft song." But for all its waywardness, Klee's imagination was connected to deep strands in German Romantic art, a vision of nature as sacramental, a gift of God, mysterious and benevolent. Hence his liking for subjects which had long been part of the Romantic repertoire. Icy mountains, for instance, with a stand of jagged pines. He used abstraction as a way of sharpening his perception of nature, and ours too. In fact, the central theme of Klee's work, to which his watercolours and paintings return over and over again, is the Garden of Paradise, all life composed under the eye of natural order. Klee taught painting at the Bauhaus in Germany in the 20s, and one of his colleagues there was the first artist to try to paint transcendental images that were completely abstract. His name was Wassily Kandinsky. Kandinsky was Russian. He came to art late. He didn't begin until he was past 30. Folk art and the Russian icon were his early influences, and they showed in his bright patterns of flat colour. Of course, he'd looked at fauve paintings too, as you can see in this Kandinsky from the early 1900s. But gradually the patterns become more abstract. These shapes are not immediately recognisable as women, but there they are, in the midst of a pastoral scene with animals. In the landscapes he painted at Murnau, near Munich in 1908, the forms are broader and freer, the colour more localised and specific.
Colour directly influences the soul. Colour is the keyboard. The eyes are the hammers. The soul is the piano with many keys. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another, with purpose, to create vibrations. So it follows that colour harmony must rest ultimately on intentional playing upon the human soul. This is one of the guiding principles of internal necessity.
So the next step was pure abstraction. Kandinsky was a theosophist, and he believed that the sins of man came from too much material reality. He thought an age of the spirit was coming and was sure the right art for it would be totally abstract, ideal and immaterial. Although Kandinsky painted his first abstract pictures around 1911, the natural world continued to offer images of another sort to both painters and sculptors. Some of the greatest images in modern art come from the tranquil assurance that however abstract you may get, there is no break between human culture and the natural order. And the high priest of this feeling was the son of a Carpathian peasant. His name was Constantin Brancusi. He lived in Paris and he died here in 1957. And this was his studio, a place visibly sacred to tools and to the beauty of the marks that they make. Coming out of a strong craft background, Brancusi knew the nature of his substances very well, the qualities of bronze, timber, marble, limestone, plaster. He wanted his sculpture to have, as substance, the same perfection that his subjects had as organisms. What this rapturous feeling for the skin of materials produced was sculpture that declared itself in mass and in contour and in surface, but not in detail. It began to look as timeless and as perfect as a new-laid egg. Brancusi wanted to find the most compressed form that still contained the subject. Not geometrical, always organic, like this stone fish, whose shape makes you see it slipping through layers of water. Or the minimum form repeated, as in his endless columns, composed of units that in theory could keep going up forever. In every piece, the tightest possible image. Whereas for Brancusi, nature was pure and clearly defined, there was an alternative tradition running through American painting that had its roots in grandeur and the mysteries of landscape. In the 19th century, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River had come to typify what the American wilderness meant to artists. It represented the designs of God, his unedited manuscript. There was no question of painting a place like this as a metaphor of the human soul. Human beings don't enter into it. No soul is that vast. To paint what you saw was enough. And this, I think, is the underlying reason why so much American romantic art from the 19th century to the mid-20th was less a description of the troubled self than a sustained homage to vastness and antiquity. Looking for images of the sublime, painters went even further west than the Grand Canyon to the valley of the Yosemite. The feelings set off by such places had been described by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God.
Much later, an American evangelist said that his idea of God was a sort of luminous oblong blur. And this was the unwitting text for the paintings of the American abstract expressionist Mark Rothko in the 1950s. Rothko kept the format of landscape, the soft rectangles that can be read as sky and flat plain, sometimes with a bar like the horizon in between. But he gave the colour a kind of breathing intensity, and that, more than any reference to landscape as such, is what the paintings are about. They try to suggest that transcendence of Emerson's, but through light and colour alone. There wasn't much direct landscape imagery in abstract expressionism, and the general line was to deny that it was there at all, in case the paintings looked less radical and less abstract than they really were. But all the same, it was there in an oblique way, and the form that it took was a concern with giant scale. A painting like this one by Jackson Pollock is almost large enough to walk into. The space it suggests is not just an illusion, but a physical fact, at least in 2 dimensions. In it, the web of paint takes on a completely physical look like nature itself. The eye can't take it in all at once. It goes from knot to knot, from skein to skein, assembling the details into a whole as one assembles a landscape by looking at it. Now, abstract expressionism was less the creation of cowboys, but of New York Jews. All the same, space itself, radiant, optimistic, endless, was very much an American myth, and it was bound to affect them in some degree or another. And on Jackson Pollock, who was not a migrant's son, but a native American from the western states, its effect was very large indeed. Pollock was the first American artist to influence the course of world art. For the last 10 years of his life, until he died in a car crash in 1956, he lived and worked on Long Island outside New York.
My painting is direct. I usually paint on the floor. I enjoy working on a large canvas. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all 4 sides, and be in the painting, similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping fluid paint. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them.
Pollock's drip technique used to be treated as a joke, as though he were out of control. But he wasn't. The drips of paint were spontaneous, but they fell just where he wanted them, building the surface into a web of skeins and subtle energies working across the whole canvas. Pollock once declared that he wanted to become nature. What did he mean? That he wanted to work parallel with its variety, its unpredictability, and above all, its vitality. He had a very light hand. Sometimes, as in Blue Poles, you might be looking at a sort of abstract Tiepolo, the same kind of airy, light and sprightly drawing. This nervous energy of Pollock's, expanding under strict control, seems to refute the picture of him as a rip-roaring wildcatter from Middle America. Only intelligence, allied to a deep sense of the natural world, can produce work like this. Another leading figure in abstract expressionism, both as painter and as writer, was Robert Motherwell, the last major collagist in the tradition of Georges Braque, but perhaps best known for his series of black and white paintings, the Elegies for the Spanish Republic. He has always preferred to keep direct imagery out of his work.
A painting is, so to speak, working by indirection, synthesizing what it scanned both internally and externally, in which the real object is not the world, but the canvas itself.
I always loved that title of Max Ernst on one of his pictures, The Blind Swimmer. I think in a way we all worked as blind swimmers, as quite good swimmers, but quite blind. What the black was doing was slowly becoming a somber force, but also a brilliant force. There are certain painters who use black as a color as vividly as other artists can use fire engine red, let's say. But in the end, it seems that in my mind, a black is also symbolic of death.
Motherwell's Spanish elegies were provoked by the memory of the Civil War, though their field of suggestion is not only political. But in the meantime, what happened to the older ambitions of abstract art, like Kandinsky's hope that it could bring about some kind of spiritual change in those who saw it? The last religious commission given to a major artist is actually in America. It's here in Houston, Texas, where the de Menil family built a non-denominational chapel, a space for contemplation. They also commissioned the abstract expressionist Mark Rothko to do paintings for it. This was in 1964, and they were installed, finished, in 1971, a year after his death. In this chapel, Rothko, who was soon to commit suicide, took to its ultimate extreme the idea that colour, in this case a very narrow range of colours from dark plummy red through violet to black, could carry the whole load of a spiritual experience. This is truly the last silence of Romanticism. I can't enter this chapel without emotion. but I never know whether I'm feeling what Rothko meant me to feel. He wanted to be a great religious artist. He was not only a Jew, but a Russian Jew, and he wanted his paintings to act like icons and to possess the full moral seriousness of the Russian novel. Now, he had the wrong equipment for this. He had an exquisite sense of nuance and silence and vagueness. But this he wanted to carry the full patriarchal grandeur of the Old Testament. It couldn't, and these paintings are the result. These are not active images. They're more like zones of silence, blank slates which you complete by looking at them. And what they present as sacred is the state of receptivity, of slow looking. In fact, the condition of being an artist, of being Mark Rothko. The world has drained out of them. Now, does that make them religious art? Holier men than I have thought so in this chapel. And if I have my doubts, it's because they're so very withdrawn. The horizons and storms of earlier romantic sublimities have gone, and what is left as the sole subject of contemplation is a void.
Stay with us, there's another chance to catch tonight's matchup of minds in all new Only Connect next.